An old woman walked alone through freezing rain on a January night, moving slowly up the long gravel road toward Halworth House. She carried nothing but a thin walking stick and wore a dress so faded it had lost whatever color it once held. Her shoes were cracked at the soles. Her gray hair hung flat and wet against her skull. Every few steps, she stopped and pressed one hand against her ribs, drawing air through her teeth. Anyone watching from the warm windows of the great house above would have seen a creature barely worth noticing. A beggar, a widow lost on the road, the kind of woman you forget the moment you look away. That was precisely the idea. Inside Halworth House, 30 candles burned in the long dining room, and the table had been laid for 12. Lord James Halworth, Duke of Halworth, stood at the far window with a glass of wine he had not touched. He was 36 years old, tall and broad across the shoulders, with dark hair cut short, and a jaw that looked as though it had been set in place by someone who did not believe in softness. He had the kind of face that made women sit straighter when he entered a room. He also had £40,000 a year, 600 acres of farmland, a house with 42 rooms, and no wife. The no wife part had become a problem. Not for him, for everyone else. If you have ever watched a story like this and felt something stir in your chest, something that made you stay a little longer than you planned, you are exactly where you are meant to be. Stay close. This one is going to stay with you. For 3 winters, the finest families in the north had paraded their daughters before him at dinners and dances and country weekends. 3 winters of beautiful faces and practiced smiles and conversations that circled the same polished ground. His horses, his land, his opinion of the new road, his health. James had smiled through all of it. He had danced when expected. He had complimented gowns and laughed at small jokes and escorted young women to supper with every correct attention. And at the end of each season, he had gone home alone, to Halworth, sat in his mother's old chair by the fire, and pressed the heels of his hands against his closed eyes, until the ache behind them dulled. He was not looking for beauty. He had seen beauty. Beauty came to him on silver trays 3 times a year. He was looking for something he could not name, and the not being able to name it was the worst part, because it meant he could not tell anyone what was missing, and so everyone assumed he was simply too particular, or too proud, or too cold. He was none of those things. He was tired. Tonight was the start of the Halworth Winter Charity Dinner, a tradition his late father had begun. 3 nights of feasting, with the great families of the county invited on the first night, and the poor of the parish invited on the third. The middle night was for both. His mother had written the guest list herself, before she left for the coast a month ago. Her health had been poor. She had gone south for the air, she said, and had asked James to host the dinner without her. He had agreed. He did not know she had never gone south at all. He did not know she was, at that very moment, standing in the freezing rain at the bottom of his own gravel road, dressed in a dead woman's clothes, with cracked shoes and a borrowed walking stick. Lady Catherine Halworth, Dowager Duchess of Halworth, was 71 years old. She had buried a husband she loved. She had raised a son she loved more, and she had watched that son grow quieter and heavier with each passing year, and had seen the light in him go down like a lamp turned low, and had understood with the sharp clarity of a woman who has lived long and watched carefully that the thing killing her son was not loneliness. It was the wrong kind of company. So she had made a plan. She had told James she was going to the coast. She had packed a trunk and sent it ahead. She had dismissed her lady's maid for the week. And then she had gone, not south, but to a small rented room above a chandler's shop in the village, where she had spent 3 days preparing. She had traded her silk for wool, her pearls for plain buttons. She had practiced stooping lower than she needed to. She had roughened her hands with cold water and garden soil. And tonight she would arrive at her own son's charity dinner as a beggar woman, unknown and unnamed, and she would sit among the poor, and she would watch. She would watch the beautiful Miss Arabella Stratton, who was the front runner for the Duke's hand, and whose smile could charm birds from the hedgerow. She would watch the elegant Miss Pemberton, whose family owned half the land adjoining Halworth. She would watch Miss Caldwell, whose father had hinted at a generous settlement. She would watch all of them, and she would see which of these polished, lovely, well-bred women would be kind to an old nobody when no advantage could come from it. The front doors of Halworth House opened at 7, and the guests arrived in a steady line of carriages. Miss Arabella Stratton came first, because she always came first. She was 23, golden hair, skin like fresh milk, a green silk gown that caught the candlelight and threw it back in soft waves. She entered the hall as though the house already belonged to her. Behind her came Miss Pemberton, dark-haired and composed, with her mother at her elbow, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then Miss Caldwell, small and pretty, with a laugh that rang a note too high. Then others, 7 in all. The best the county had to offer, arriving in silk and in pearl, smelling of lavender and ambition. James greeted each one at the door. He said the right things. He noticed that every one of them glanced past him as they entered, measuring the room, counting the other women, calculating. He noticed and said nothing. At the far end of the hall, the second door opened, the small door, the one used by the parish poor on charity nights. Through it came the others, old men with stiff knees, widows in darned shawls, a blind cobbler led by his daughter, a woman carrying a child too thin for the season. They filed in quietly and took their places at the lower table, the one set with pewter instead of silver, with tallow candles instead of beeswax. Among them, stooped and slow, clutching her walking stick, came an old woman in a faded dress with wet gray hair and cracked shoes. Nobody looked at her twice. She took a seat at the very end of the lower table, nearest the draught from the kitchen door, and folded her rough hands in her lap, and waited. The dinner began. At the upper table, the conversation sparkled. Miss Stratton held the Duke's attention with a story about a horse race she had attended in York. She told it well. Her timing was sharp. Her laughter was placed with care. James listened and smiled, and cut his meat, and thought of nothing. At the lower table, the old woman in the faded dress ate her soup slowly, watching everything. She watched Miss Stratton lean close to the Duke and touch his sleeve. She watched Miss Pemberton smile at a footman, and then, when the footman was slow with the bread, watched that same smile vanish like a snuffed wick. She watched Miss Caldwell push her chair back sharply when a parish child wandered too close to the upper table, brushing the boy aside without a word. She watched, and she remembered. Halfway through the second course, the old woman began to cough. It started small, a dry, catching sound in her chest. She pressed her napkin to her mouth and turned away from the table. The coughing grew worse. Her thin shoulders shook. Her face went dark. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands, and the sound coming out of her was raw and torn, the sound of lungs that had breathed too much cold air and too little warmth. The poor folk near her shifted uneasily. One old man patted her back. The blind cobbler's daughter offered water. At the upper table, no one turned. The laughter continued. The wine was poured. Miss Stratton was telling another story, and the candles burned on. The coughing fit passed. The old woman sat back, breathing hard, her hands shaking in her lap. A line of wet ran from the corner of her eye, down the crease of her cheek. Whether from the coughing or from something else, no one at the upper table would ever know, because no one at the upper table had looked. But someone else had. At the far side of the hall, near the kitchen passage, a young woman stood with a stack of empty serving plates balanced against her hip. She was not a guest. She was not a servant either, exactly. Her name was Clara Bourne, and she was 22 years old, and she was the daughter of the late rector of St. Martin's at Bourne Cross, and she was here tonight because the Halworth housekeeper had hired her for 3 shillings to help carry dishes from the kitchen, since 2 of the regular girls were down with the same winter cold that had emptied half the village. Clara was not beautiful. She was not plain either. She had brown hair pinned back with a single brass pin, and a face that was more interesting than pretty, the kind of face that changed depending on what she was thinking. Right now she was thinking about the old woman at the end of the lower table, who had just coughed, as though something inside her was tearing loose. Clara set the plates down on the sideboard. She looked toward the upper table, where 12 well-dressed people were laughing over roast duck. She looked toward the kitchen, where the cook was shouting about the pudding. She looked back at the old woman. Then she moved. She crossed the hall with a cup of warm broth she had taken from the kitchen tray, and she knelt beside the old woman's chair, and she said in a voice low enough that only the 2 of them could hear it, "Here, now, drink this. Small sips. I have you." The old woman's shaking hands closed around the cup. And Lady Catherine Halworth, Dowager Duchess of Halworth, looked into the face of a hired dish carrier, making 3 shillings for the night, and felt something shift behind her ribs, like a door swinging open, in a room that had been locked for years. She drank the broth, and she watched Clara Bourne walk back to the kitchen passage and pick up her stack of plates, and carry on as though she had done nothing at all. The pudding course came and went, and the upper table grew louder with wine and warmth. Miss Stratton had moved her chair closer to the Duke, close enough that when she laughed, her shoulder brushed his arm, close enough that the whole room could see it and draw the obvious conclusion. James did not move away. He did not move closer either. He sat like a man, enduring weather. At the lower table, the old woman in the faded dress had finished her broth and sat with the empty cup between her hands, turning it slowly, watching the room with eyes that missed nothing. She had been watching Clara Bourne for the past half hour. She had watched the girl carry plates without complaint, refill cups at the lower table before anyone asked, guide the blind cobbler's daughter to the privy and back without a word of fuss, and slip her own small supper roll into the pocket of the too thin woman with the baby, thinking no one had seen. Someone had seen. The evening turned. At 10 o'clock, the tables were cleared and the chairs pushed back, and a fiddler was brought in for the dancing, as was custom at the Halworth charity dinner. The upper guests danced. The lower guests watched from the benches along the wall, or talked quietly among themselves, or dozed in the warmth of the dying fires. Miss Stratton danced with the Duke first. She danced well. Her feet were light and precise. Her green silk caught the firelight, and her golden hair moved like something painted. James held her at the correct distance and turned her through the figures, and his face showed nothing at all. When the dance ended, Miss Stratton curtsied and said something close to his ear. Whatever it was, he shook his head once, small and final, and stepped back. She curtsied again, but the shape of her mouth had changed. The second dance was Miss Pemberton's. She was less graceful, but more determined, holding his hand a fraction too firmly, steering him through the turns, as though the dance were a negotiation. James endured it. The third dance was Miss Caldwell's, and during this dance, the thing that Lady Catherine had been waiting for finally happened. The old woman stood from her bench to move closer to the fire, and her cracked shoe caught the edge of a loose board, and she went down. Not hard, not dangerously, but she went down, sideways against a bench, her walking stick clattering away across the stone floor, her thin body folding like wet paper. The sound of the stick on stone was sharp enough to cut through the fiddle music. Several heads turned. Miss Caldwell, mid-step in the dance, glanced over her shoulder at the fallen woman, and her face passed through a quick series of adjustments. She turned back to the Duke with her high laugh. These charity nights, one really must watch where one steps. Miss Pemberton, standing near the punch table, looked at the old woman on the floor and looked away, as one looks away from a stain on a tablecloth. Unpleasant, not her concern. Miss Stratton did not look at all. She was watching the Duke's face, reading it for opportunity, and had no attention to spare for fallen beggars. The old woman lay against the bench with her hand stretched out for the walking stick she could not reach. 3 seconds passed. 5. 8. The poor folk near her were old themselves, slow to rise, uncertain of their place. The footmen stood along the walls like furniture, waiting for instruction that did not come. Then Clara came through the kitchen door with a tray of clean glasses and saw the old woman on the floor, and the tray was on the nearest table before the glasses had stopped rattling. She crossed the room at a pace that made 2 footmen step aside. She dropped to her knees on the cold stone beside the old woman and gathered her up, one arm beneath the thin shoulders, the other reaching for the walking stick. "There you are," she said. "There you are. I have the stick. Can you grip my arm? Good. Now up. Slowly. 1 breath, then another. Good. If you are still here, still listening, then you already know this story is building towards something that will not leave you easily. Hold on, the turn is close now." She got the old woman to her feet and into a chair by the fire, and she pulled a footstool close and lifted the old woman's cracked shoes onto it, and she took the thin, cold hands between her own warm ones and rubbed them. "Your hands are like river stones," Clara said. "When did you last sit near a proper fire? Here, closer. Give me that shawl. It is soaked through." She unwound her own woolen wrap from her shoulders and put it around the old woman instead. It was not a fine wrap. It was brown and darned at one corner, and worth perhaps 2 shillings. It was also the only warm thing Clara Bourne owned, and she gave it without hesitation to a stranger she would never see again, in a room full of women wearing silk who had not moved from their chairs. Lady Catherine felt the rough, warm wool settle around her shoulders and closed her eyes. She had her answer. Across the room, James Halworth had seen it all. He had seen it because he had been looking in the wrong direction for a duke. Away from the dancing, away from Miss Caldwell's high laugh and Miss Stratton's green silk and the whole glittering display that had been mounted for his benefit. He had been looking toward the fire, where an old woman had fallen and a dish carrier had run. He watched Clara rub the old woman's hands. He watched her give up her own wrap. He watched her pull the chair closer to the fire and tuck the footstool tighter and say something that made the old woman's mouth curve upward for the first time all evening. His chest did something strange, a tightness that was not painful, a pressure behind his ribs that felt like recognition. He set down his wine. "Who is that girl?" he said to the footman nearest him. "The one by the fire, your grace? That is Clara Bourne, hired for the evening, the rector's daughter from Bourne Cross, 3 shillings for the night." James said nothing for a long moment. Then he walked across the hall, not toward the dancing, not toward the beautiful women waiting for him to choose, toward the fire. Miss Stratton watched him go, with her lips pressed into a line so thin they nearly vanished. He reached the fireside and stood there, and Clara looked up from the old woman's hands with an expression that was not impressed or calculating or even particularly interested. It was the expression of someone interrupted in the middle of a task. "Your Grace," she said, and went back to rubbing the old woman's hands. "Is she hurt?" James said. Her hip took the knock. "Nothing broken, I think. But she is cold through, and she should not walk home in this. Can your man find a cart? Something with straw in it, so she does not rattle about." She was giving the Duke of Halworth instructions. She did not seem to notice she was doing it. James felt his mouth pull sideways, a feeling he had almost forgotten. "I will see to it." "Good. And a blanket for the cart, a proper one. That horse blanket your grooms use will not do." She has been cold enough tonight." He looked at her. The brass pin in her brown hair, the bare shoulders where the wrap had been, the red knees where she had knelt on stone. "You will be cold yourself," he said. "I am not 70 years old and alone on a January night. I will manage." He shrugged out of his coat. It was dark blue wool, cut by a London tailor, worth more than Clara Bourne would earn in a year. He held it out. She stared at it, then at him. "I cannot take your coat, Your Grace." "You gave her your wrap. Someone ought to give you something in return. The exchange may as well start here." Clara Bourne looked at the Duke of Halworth for a long, steady moment, and whatever she saw in his face made her take the coat. She pulled it around her shoulders, and it swallowed her whole, and she looked down at herself inside it, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I look ridiculous." "You look like the only honest person in this house," said the Duke of Halworth. At the fireside, tucked in Clara's brown wrap, Lady Catherine Halworth kept her eyes closed, and her breathing steady, and let the smallest smile cross her old mouth. Her son had found the girl, or the girl had found her. Which was better? The cart was brought round with straw and a wool blanket, and James himself walked the old woman to the kitchen door, where the cold would not hit her until the last moment. Clara walked on the other side, one hand steady beneath the old woman's elbow, still wearing the Duke's blue coat, like a tent draped over a fence post. At the door, the old woman stopped. She turned her face up toward Clara, and reached out with one thin hand, and touched the girl's cheek, just once, the pad of her thumb against Clara's jaw, the kind of touch a mother gives, not a stranger. Clara went still. "You are a good girl," the old woman said. Her voice had changed, steadier now, clearer, as though the quaver had slipped and something sharper had shone through underneath. "You do not know how good, but you will." Clara blinked. "You should rest, not talk. Save your breath for the morning." "Oh, I intend to use my breath a great deal in the morning," said the old woman, and something in the way she said it made James glance at her, a flicker of something almost familiar crossing his face. But the night was dark, and the woman was old and bent and wrapped in a brown shawl, and the flicker passed. The cart took her away into the black. Clara stood at the kitchen door and watched the lantern on the cart grow small, her arms folded across the Duke's enormous coat. James stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The cold pressed in. Their breath came out in white clouds that dissolved against the dark sky. Somewhere behind them in the hall, the fiddle was still playing, and Miss Stratton was still dancing, though with whom, it was no longer clear, and no longer mattered. "You will want your coat back," Clara said. "Not yet. Your guests will wonder where you have gone. Let them wonder." She looked at him sideways. "You are a strange sort of Duke, Your Grace." "I am beginning to think I have been the usual sort for too long." Clara said nothing to that. She pulled the coat tighter. Not for warmth now, but the way a person holds something when they are thinking. "I should go back to the kitchen," she said. "There are plates still to clear, and the cook will dock my pay if she finds me standing about talking to dukes in the dark." 3 shillings, James said. 3 shillings, Clara repeated, "which is a side of bacon and a week of candles, and I would rather not lose either." She gave him back his coat. She folded it carefully first, which he noticed, because every other woman he had met would have either clung to it or tossed it back with a show of not caring. Clara folded it the way a person folds something that belongs to someone else and ought to be returned in good order. Then she went back to the kitchen and washed plates until midnight, and walked home in the dark along the Bourne Cross Road, 2 miles with no lantern and no wrap, because she had given her wrap to an old woman she would never see again. She did not think about the Duke on the walk home. She thought about whether the old woman was warm enough in the cart. She thought about the thin woman with the baby, and whether the supper roll had been enough. She thought about the blind cobbler's daughter, who had whispered to her in the privy that she was frightened of the dark, which was a sad and private thing for a girl who lived in permanent darkness to admit. And Clara had held her hand and walked her back to the hall and said nothing about it to anyone. She thought about these things because these were the things that lived in her. Not ambition, not calculation, a current that ran beneath her like groundwater, invisible and constant, pulling her always in the same direction, toward whoever was alone, toward whoever had fallen, toward whatever the rest of the room had decided was not worth turning around for. She reached the small house at Bourne Cross at midnight and let herself in quietly and sat by the dead fire in her aunt's kitchen, still smelling of dishwater and candle smoke, and pressed her cold fingers against her cold cheeks and allowed herself one thought about the Duke. He had kind eyes. Then she put the thought away, because kind eyes on a Duke were no use to a girl with 3 shillings and a torn wrap, and she went to bed. The morning broke gray and sharp, with frost on the window glass, and a sky the color of old pewter. Clara woke early, dressed in her second dress, which was worse than her first, and went to the kitchen to boil water. Her aunt was already up, sitting at the table with a letter. "This came an hour ago," her aunt said. "A man on a horse brought it. A man on a very good horse." Clara took the letter. The paper was thick and cream-colored. The seal on the back was pressed in dark red wax. She broke it open. The handwriting inside was not what she expected. It was thin and angular, an old woman's hand, not a young man's. It read, "My dear girl, you gave me your wrap and your broth and your kindness last night, and you do not know who I am. I should very much like you to know. Come to Hallworth House this morning, if you are able. Come to the front door, not the kitchen. Ask for Lady Catherine, and bring nothing. You have already brought everything that matters." Clara read it twice. "Lady Catherine," she said aloud. "There is no Lady Catherine at Hallworth. There is only the Duke and his mother is on the coast for her health." Her aunt looked at her over the edge of her teacup and said nothing. Clara folded the letter and put it in her pocket and walked the 2 miles to Hallworth House for the second time in 12 hours, this time by daylight, this time by the front road, this time with a feeling beneath her ribs like a rope being pulled from both ends. The avenue of Hallworth was long and lined with bare elms, and the house at the end of it sat against the gray sky like something that had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. Stone walls, 3 feet thick, windows that reflected the morning light back like blind eyes. Clara had seen the house 100 times from the road. She had never walked toward its front door. She reached the steps and stood there. The door opened before she could knock. James Hallworth stood in the doorway. He was not dressed as he had been the night before. No coat, no cravat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his hair was uncombed, and he looked as though he had been awake for some time. He looked at her, and something crossed his face. Not surprise. He had been expecting her. Something else. Something like a breath held too long and finally released. "You came," he said. "I was invited. The letter said to ask for Lady Catherine. I do not know any Lady Catherine." "You do," said James. "You met her last night. You gave her your wrap." Clara went very still. The air between them thinned. And then, from behind James in the great hall, came the sound of footsteps. Not shuffling, not unsteady. The firm, clear tread of a woman who had been walking her own floors for 40 years. Lady Catherine Hallworth came into view. She was upright. Her back was straight. Her gray hair was pinned beneath a lace cap, and her dress was dark silk, with pearl buttons, and her face, the same face that had looked up from the floor last night, quavering and frail, was sharp and bright, and entirely in command. She was not bent. She was not broken. She was not shaking. She was magnificent. Clara stared. Her mouth opened, and no sound came out. There, now, said Lady Catherine, coming to stand beside her son. "Now you see me as I am. Last night you saw me as I wished to be seen, an old nobody, a pauper on a charity bench, and you were kind to me when every fine woman in the room stepped past me, as though I were a mark on the floor." Clara's hands had come up to cover her mouth. "I set a trap," Lady Catherine said, and her voice held no apology. "I dressed as a beggar, and sat among the poor, and waited to see who among all those lovely, well-bred, silk-wearing daughters would stoop for an old woman who could offer them nothing, and they stepped over me. Every one. Miss Stratton looked through me, as though I were glass. Miss Caldwell complained about charity nights while I lay on the stones. Miss Pemberton turned her back. She took a step closer to Clara. And you, a girl earning 3 shillings, carrying plates, knelt on cold stone and gave me broth, and rubbed my hands, and wrapped me in the only warm thing you owned. And you did it for nobody, for a stranger, for a woman you believed you would never see again." Clara's hands came down from her mouth. Her chin was trembling, but her eyes were dry and steady. "I did it because you had fallen," Clara said. "That is the only reason there is." "Yes," said Lady Catherine. "That is the only reason. And it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything I came to find." She turned to her son. "Here she is, James. Here is the one I have been looking for. I tested every beauty in the county, and they all failed. And this girl, who was not even a guest, who was carrying plates for 3 shillings, passed without knowing she was being tested, which is the only way to pass it truly." James had not taken his eyes off Clara. Clara looked at him, and her jaw tightened. "You knew," she said. "Last night, when you came to the fire, you knew who she was." "I did not," James said. "I did not know until an hour ago, when she came down those stairs and told me everything. I came to the fire last night for the same reason you did, because an old woman had fallen, and no one had gone to her, and because the girl who did go was the first real person I had seen in 3 years." Clara stood on the stone steps of Halworth House, in her second-best dress, with the letter still in her pocket, and she looked at the Duke and his mother, and her face went through something complicated and private. "I am a rector's daughter with 3 shillings to her name," she said. "I cannot be what you are looking for." "You already are," said James. "You were before you knew there was anything to look for. That is the whole point. That is the only point. Every other woman in that room last night would have helped her if they had known she was a duchess. You helped her because she was old and cold and on the floor. There is a difference between those two things, and I have spent 3 years learning what it is." Clara said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved through the bare elms along the avenue. A crow called from the roof of the east wing. The morning light shifted, and the frost on the steps began to darken with melt. "Your mother is watching us very closely," Clara said. "She has been watching people closely for 71 years. She is extremely good at it. She tricked the entire county. She did. She fell on purpose. She is not sorry about it. I gave her my only good rap. She is sorry about that. She intends to replace it." Clara looked at Lady Catherine, who stood in the doorway with her hands clasped, and her cunning old face bright, with something that made her look 30 years younger. "I would like my wrap back," Clara said. "It was darned at the corner, but it was warm, and it was mine." "Come inside," said Lady Catherine, "and I will give you the wrap, and a great deal more besides, if you will let me." Clara Bourne stood on the steps of Halworth House, and looked up at the windows and the stone walls, and the bare elms moving against the January sky. Then she looked at James Halworth, who stood in his shirt-sleeves in the cold with his hands open at his sides, waiting. She stepped through the door.